Good afternoon and welcome to today's session of our Lunch and Learns. Just before we start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the land and those of the land we are on, the peoples of the Kulin Nation. I also pay my respects to their elders past and present. Each week, as you know, we talk to different specialists. Today, we have Amir Farazmand from V-Line. This session will run for 30 minutes with 10 minutes of questions at the end. Just a little bit of housekeeping here. We have the mics are muted, but any questions that you have, please pop them into the chat or the Q&A and we'll run through them at the end. I think it's about time to hand over to Lauren and Amir to go through the session. The sessions are also recorded, so sometime next week we'll upload the video to our Knowledge Hub. If you would actually like to access that and don't have access, please let us know at ecologiQ's email address, which will pop up at the end. So thanks, Lauren and Amir. I'll leave it over to you.
Thanks very much, Cheryl. Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's session. Amir, welcome. Thank you for joining us today. It's great to have you.
Thank you.
First of all, can you tell us what your role is at V-Line?
I'm a civil engineer specializing in geotechnical area, and I've been 2 years with V-Line, but got over 20 years experience in civil and geotechnical engineering.
Fantastic. So we'll start off with the basics today. What exactly is a type approval?
So type approval is a process which we use to grant a product certificate which shows it conforms with our technical and safety requirement before it's being used on a railway track.
Okay, and that's specifically, you're talking V-Line owned track only, being for V-Line.
It is a bit complex there because we use as an operator, we lease the track, so we technically don't own the tracks, but because we operate the tracks, still we pretty much have the final say in the products to be used or to be added on that leased track.
Fantastic. So having a type approval for V-Line, that essentially means that a product is able to be used within that piece of track that V-Line operates.
That's right, yes.
And what kinds of products require that type approval?
So mainly the material which is like in the manufacturing, the products that comes from a manufacturing environment where generally, as you know, in the manufacturing, you have an initial design and construction process, and you assume all the types of that product is going to follow the same standard and quality. And therefore, like, for example, if we build a bridge, we don't call it a type approval. We have a designer team which designs every part. And usually there is enough budget to do that for the bridge, considering it's a structure that has adequate budget for that. But for other products, for example, one part of a signaling equipment, this is possibly produced in thousands, and each part does not require to go through the same process and assessment. And when one is sufficient and satisfactory, we consider that to be adequate, and that's where the type approval process comes in. So we make sure we check the manufacturing and quality of that product coming out of the line, and then we can use it without repeating this process again.
Okay, so what you're kind of saying is something like a bridge, which would be unique. Each bridge that is built would be unique. You wouldn't have two exactly the same bridges built. So that doesn't require a type approval because it would be part of the design, but something that is kind of mass manufactured and will go into something that is repeated, such as the signaling, like you said, that would require a type approval as a manufactured product.
That is right. Like, to be a bit more like a bit simpler example, like concrete, for example, is a material we consider it. We don't need a type approval for it, but a concrete forming a stormwater pit, for example, a drainage pit, that requires type approval, or a concrete pipe, for example, that requires type approval.
Yeah. And how about materials? So things such as fill or recycled glass sand, to use an example.
So it's mentioned, like, if it is called like a raw material, we generally don't need type approval. So they usually have a specifications, like, for example, the grading size of the material, the density of the material. And similarly, we looked at for recycled crush glass, and we decided to have its own standard. So we actually have a standard in V-Line. So we consider that as a raw material. So technically we expanded on that type approval to have a standard for it. So now you can go to standard and check the quality or some other requirement of that material. For example, we concerned about contamination of the crush glass, obviously coming from, say, an urban environment. We want to make sure there is no contamination in it. And or could be other consideration like dust, for example, because it is crushed, so it could have dust that can be harmful. So for that material, we have the standard. So it's sort of, there are a lot of overlaps between the standard and type approval, but type approval, we actually have to go through individually, while the standard might make the life a bit easier for the designers to go through. Yeah.
Cool. And I know that, to use an example, V-Line recently, in collaboration with ecologiQ, type approved Allstone Quarries, who are in Bendigo, for their recycled glass sand product. Now, it's my understanding from what you've said that recycled glass sand doesn't necessarily require that type approval, because there's a specification. So long as it meets it, then type approval is not required. But is there a benefit to Allstone Quarries, and what is that benefit in having that product or material type approved anyway?
Actually, for a product to require type approval or not, we actually pretty strict on that. So if a product does not need type approval, we emphasize that we don't need type approval for that. And otherwise, also, if it needs, we obviously stress that we need that type approval for it. So it has to be specific to that, whether it's required or not. So we will not do type approval for something that doesn't need type approval. So
yeah, okay. So let's go move along and talk a little bit more about the actual type approval process next. I guess to get started, who starts that process? Who kind of is able to apply for a type approval? Is it the supplier that can do it themselves, or does it need project sponsorship for someone who's looking to use the product first?
So it can be either case. So sometimes the project engineer comes up with the material from the supplier, and then they ask us to do the type approval. Or it can be suppliers, because a lot of our suppliers are already in our approved list, so they know our processes, and say they have a new product, they will approach us and say, we want to use this in the track or in the signaling or other parts, and we require a type approval for it, and then we start looking into it.
Okay, so it can actually come from, I guess, anywhere. That type of approval can be.
That's right.
That process.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay. Sorry.
But just wanted to clarify, most of the entities or people who are contacting us, they have business with us already. So we possibly wouldn't see a manufacturer overseas randomly send us something for a type approval. So there is usually a bit of background to the product. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So I wanted to just share really quickly. This might be a little bit more helpful for the audience members. So this is a page out of the NIST, I think NIPR 1310, which is the type approval process document of V-Lines. And this shows a flow chart of the type approval process and procedure. That's very confusing to me. So I just thought it might be useful to use this as we talk a little bit more about the process that a product goes through in obtaining type approval. So I might just zoom in on this top bit where everyone can see. So can you talk us a little bit, Amir, through the I guess the forms that need to be completed and the process that a product will go through for type approval?
Sure. So this is a pretty comprehensive flowchart of our type approval process. And as you can see, the very first step is a simple form which fills out the supplier details, the product details, and the proposed use, which is pretty important as well, because sometimes we type approve a product to be used, say, on a platform, but may not be adequate for a tracks, for example. So this is also important part to know where that product is going to be used. So that form NIFO 1310.6 is our initial point. So that includes the information I mentioned. And when you send that through, we have our own form. So we will fill out the 13110.3 now and do an initial evaluation, as you ask here, whether does that product need type approval or not. So we obviously very clear on that.
Yeah. And so just on those ones, because I know you and I are doing this process at the moment for Bitum Green by Geofabrics. So 1310.6, this first one, that's filled out by the supplier in application. And then 1310.3 is an internal form for V-Line. So that's not one that needs to be filled out by the applicant.
That's right. There are parts that I collaborate with them because sometimes it's pretty new for them, and I ask them to fill as much as they can, and occasionally I will have input to the materials because I've worked with geotextile. If you put there the details, there might be usage that you may not be aware we use that in our railway, and I can add that sort of information as well. So generally it's a collaboration, I would call it. We fill together these forms and present it as a case to my manager.
Okay, so what's your so you would be the V-Line's sponsor or equivalent in that type approval process?
We don't really call it as such a sponsor. So I think the project engineer would be the person you might thinking that proposes this. So because we are not in the project directly, so we're not involved in the cost assessment or choosing the actual product. So the project engineers or project managers, they propose this, but we have to make sure it meets our quality and safety standards. So well, I'm technically assessing this, but we have got obviously a couple of layers of management to also approve this.
Yeah.
Eventually, when you require the certificate, it will be signed by my manager, not myself. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so we've gone into 1310.3. How do we go? What happens from there?
So when we do that assessment, we might establish obviously whether we require the type approval or not. We obviously don't look at no, so you don't really need to worry about it. When we require the type approval, then we are doing a preliminary assessment. So we will require all the technical information available about that product, like, from very early selecting the material, manufacturing process, the laboratory testing as the product is produced, what sort of testing you might have, the quality assurance process for the product to make sure it always follows the same quality in the production line.
Mm-hmm.
And then obviously we check it against our standards to make sure those specification meets our performance requirements. And as we gather all that information, we might give it a full or minor type approvals, which is technically like an evaluation process is still required for the minor one. Like, for example, we might include a field trial for this before we give it a full type approval.
Okay, so we've got full or minor type approval and also preliminary type approval. And they all have this same next form that's filled out. So it's NIFO 1310.1. What's the difference between those three, the full, the minor, and the preliminary?
I mean, the terms might need to be updated. Let's call them provisional and full type approval at this stage. So we have two type approvals. One would be whether it's minor or full type of provisional. We give you a type approval and we do a trial on test before we give you a full type approval. So technically is a field trial, the difference.
Okay, so yeah, whether or not it requires that field trial.
Yeah. Cool,
fantastic. And assuming everything goes to plan in a type approval, everything's in order, that let's just say there's not a trial required, there's no sort of further information required from the supplier or anything. What's the minimum amount of time that it would take to actually have a type approval processed and approved?
If all the documents are ready, we generally take 4 to 6 weeks to do the type approval, whether it's minor or full. As I mentioned before, if it is more detailed testing of field trial testing required, it obviously adds to the time. So all these trials and testing might add a bit more time. Occasionally, we might ask for more test results. For example, that was a different process for the recycled glass, but we asked for a contamination testing before we go ahead with that material, which is similar to here in type approval. Occasionally, we might ask for additional laboratory testing before we provide that type approval, and that adds to that 4 to 6 weeks time.
Yeah. So yeah, so be conservative in timing.
That's
so 4 to 6 weeks at a minimum.
That's right. Yeah.
And once type approvals is granted, obviously giving everything is in order, is there any other additional steps that need to be taken before that product can be used, or is that kind of it, done, approved, put it into work?
When we give you the approval, you can pretty much use it. As I said, if it is required a field trial, we work with the supplier and monitor the performance as well. But generally, when you get the approval, you can use it anywhere in the network.
Cool. Fantastic. I'm just going to stop checking that one now. And so talking about if a supplier gains type approval for a product, obviously we work a lot in recycled materials. It's a space that's becoming ever bigger. And suppliers are also still, I guess, developing a lot of their products. They might have something that they find a way to increase the amount of recycled content in the manufacture of that product. If a supplier has a product type approved and then increases that recycled content, would you require a new type approval process to be done, or are those updates to that product able to be covered by a current type approval?
Actually, on that diagram, if you look at on the left, so I'm not sure if it's easy to
I can bring it up again. Yep.
So you can see on the left, it says type approval alteration.
Oh, yes, yeah.
And that's where when you make significant change to the product, which can change the characteristics of the material or the product, then obviously we require to go through this process. I mean, we obviously have a lot of information already available, but for example, you use a steel that its strengths might alter a bit, but we require obviously to check that to make sure it still meets the overall requirement and the specification.
Okay, fantastic. So there's actually kind of a different process that goes through to update it for a product rather than sort of starting from scratch because you've already got that information.
That's right. Yeah.
But if let's say there was a product that was, 20% recycled and they've increased that to maybe 22 or 25%, would that be a minor enough? Obviously, it depends on the product, I guess, but that would likely be a minor enough change that it would still be covered by the current approval.
That again depends on the material itself. Sometimes, for example, if you have cement content which changes by 5%, that's going to be a significant change in concrete, for example. So it's all relative. So I can't really put a number on it, but yeah, it might require, but the whole engineering team, whether on supplier side and our side, possibly have a pretty good idea whether it requires that or not. Yeah.
Best to check with V-Line.
That's right.
I know we're coming towards the end of our time, so I've just got another question before we go to audience questions. So the Recycle First policy obviously applies to all new major road and rail projects. As that asset owner or operator, V-Line, as you mentioned before, does have the final say on what can and can't be used. So that means that there's obviously going to be a lot of new recycled products and materials that will need type approval in order to be used. Is V-Line supportive of that kind of shift to this recycled materials and a more circular economy?
Definitely. We have got quite a few documents. One of the main one I'm looking, we call it SAMG6, which is titled Our Sustainability Action Plan. So we have a full policy on this, and V-Line obviously seriously follows these procedures to make sure we follow a sustainable environment requirement. And two of them there's quite a few in the policy, but two of them which might be related to this is reducing pollution and contamination by using this recycled material.
Mm-hmm.
The other one is resource consumption. Obviously, say for example, if you can use crushed glass rather than mining new sand resources, that's obviously a benefit for us. And the other one is just the general materials consumption and waste production. So we have quite a few requirements in our sustainability policies that encourage us to use this recycled material.
Great, it's fantastic. Cheryl, do we have some audience questions?
We do. We've got 3 questions, a couple from Stephen. Is there a complete list of all type approved products by V-Line available to projects to look at and ascertain whether a product needs approval or not?
Yes, we have a list of products which is type approved. I'm not sure if it can be provided to the external. Possibly doesn't need, considering it's quite a big database. Generally, the project engineers or the maintenance contact can contact us and ask whether there is already products that are there or we need to approve a new product.
Or perhaps even offer a list of what they're considering as well that you could comment on, perhaps.
That's right.
Is there one person specifically or a team of people in V-Line that should be contacted to initiate the type approval process?
As I said, our team is fairly small, so we don't directly do all the first contact sort of. Generally, our project teams are the engineers who initially start the process, because we would have like hundreds of projects, and our team is fairly small to be the first point of contact. Generally, it goes through our project management and goes to the project engineers and then comes to us.
So is that a person or a project management?
That's also a group of people there as well. So we have usually 2 methods of using products. One is through projects, one is through our maintenance. So these are all both huge departments, and generally the suppliers have pretty good idea who they're dealing with. and that person in V-Line knows how to approach us and start the process.
I guess if someone's new to it, or they're not a supplier, or they're off a project, is there a starting point that we could say go here first?
Assuming we don't get contacted by marketers or randomly, you can just contact myself. So
okay,
as long as you don't put it up in the internet.
Not trying to sell anything. Okay, we'll provide those contacts to people afterwards. We've got Priya asking, can V-Line speak to some of the type approvals they currently have going with trials? Do V-Line proactively look at high recycled or lower embodied products as alternatives to currently approved products?
We definitely look into that, because we ourselves have huge cost of disposal of waste, which sometimes we can recycle them. It can be simply a soil, for example, which is under the existing tracks, which has contamination, and it's obviously huge cost to dispose them to the landfill. But EPA, for example, recommends that if you can use contaminated material on site, assuming doesn't have impact, obviously, on the other side, that's the recommended method. And same with the recycled material. So if we can use recycled material, that would be our priority.
Perfect. A fourth question, is there a single reference document that governs type approval? I think that might be what you had, Lauren. Type approval process for different organisations, or the process is defined individually by internal teams, i.e. if you know how different would the process, oh, okay. So are there different processes for MTM, ARTC, RPV, V-Line, etc.?
We have our own full type approval process. I understand MTM has also their own method. We occasionally get the documents which they have sent to MTM, for example, considering we're both rail operators. And it greatly helps, obviously, to speed up the process, because all the documentation is already provided. But occasionally we might ask for extra documents as well. And
I mean, Lauren, I don't think I'm saying the wrong thing here, but people can come to us if they're a bit unsure as well as to who to go to Lauren or Doy in our industry team.
Absolutely, provided it's a recycled material.
Yes, oh, absolutely. Yeah, it's a recycled material, but yeah, if they're unsure, but yes, yeah. Okay. Thanks. That looks like all the questions at this stage, and we're 1 minute to finish, so that was pretty good.
How about last words of wisdom, Amir? If someone is looking at getting a type approval, what's your best piece of advice for helping expedite that process and ensuring that it goes through in a timely sort of manner?
The main requirement for us is the technical and testing documents to make sure. Generally, engineering processes are pretty similar, whether it's for our supplier or for our side. So, and they obviously have got the engineers or technical people who know about the product. So it's good to do their own initial assessment, make sure does it meet their quality standards. If it does, we're not going to be a lot more difficult. We're just rail operators, and we look to work with suppliers, obviously. And if they think the product meets their standards and the specification, it is very likely that it meets ours, but we obviously do our assessment and collaborate with them to make sure the process is done as soon as possible. You know, we obviously don't want any delays for our project as well. And these products usually are used in our projects, and we understand working together in a timely manner helps everyone.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, everyone is working to the same end, really, aren't we, at the end of the day? Yeah, perfect. Great. Look, thank you so much, Amir. Amir is happy for you to contact him, and we can probably send a link to the type approval document that Lauren had early next week. We can send it to those people who are on the session, or if you'd just like to contact us on our email, ecologic@roadprojects.vic.gov.au. We can shoot out anything that you require, and also if you require connection to the Knowledge Hub where all of these lunch and learn sessions are. So this one will probably go up next week. Our next session, next Friday, we're talking to Aaron Whitehead about OmniGrip. So the OmniGrip is a coloured surface that's been used in quite a few council areas and on NWPA in the reservoir station a couple of years ago in Darebin. So yeah, that'll be an interesting session next week. Perfect session today. Something I think lots of people are looking to find a bit more out about. So yeah, please shoot us an email, or as I said, we'll give you Amir's email, but we won't put it on the internet. Okay. All right. Thanks again, everyone, and thank you, Amir, and thank you.
Thank you.
Great session.
Thank you, Amir, and thanks, Gerald.
Thank you. Take care. See you. Bye bye.